Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking at a rather complex problem that every pianist will face when they perform piano works by Franz Schubert. In many ways, his music is similar in terms of physical demands to Mozart or early Beethoven. Occasionally, you'll find yourself with a very difficult or demanding passage, but for the most part, Schubert's music is sight-readable. The greatest challenge that Schubert presents us with in terms of performance comes from an issue of identifying what is important in the musical material to express to an audience, and then deciding how best to communicate that. Now, this definition ultimately applies to all music from all composers. It's dreadfully generic. But what I'm talking about is a very specific problem in Schubert, because in his music, he frequently puts several vectors of communication on hold, or in stasis, so that we're focusing only upon one. To make matters more difficult, this last vector may not be particularly active or interesting on the surface level. This, in its most simplest terms, creates a kind of musical dead zone. The question which I'm frequently asked regarding Schubert is, how do I deal with this dead zone? As is often the case in music discussion, it's far easier to play something than to describe it in words. Consider the first middle section of the first Impromptu from Opus 142. I'll play it in full, with all the repeats, so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Listen to the gestures, the harmony, and the accompaniment. Specifically, consider what elements of the music Schubert decides to continually change and to what extent this change occurs, and what elements he decides to keep in stasis, or in a holding pattern. ways, this middle section is built similarly to development sections in his later piano sonatas. Schubert decides upon a texture and gestural pattern, and then holds it in stasis while exploring different keys. Here, we have continuous 16th notes in the accompaniment. These frame the harmony, but they do not travel outside the middle register, and they never stop. The melody consists of gestures, which, again, are similar throughout. They alternate between upper and lower registers in a pattern which becomes quite predictable after the first repeat. Before we go any further, I'd like to talk a little about what we as musicians tend to focus on when we are expressing emotion or thought through music. Communication in music is based upon change. The rate, the range, and the relations between these changes. It's that simple. For quite a large majority of the Baroque, classical, and Romantic music, there is a tradition of maintaining one or two vectors of expression simple, while making others complex in terms of their changes. For example, in Bach, you'll find a rhythmic structure set up at the beginning of a piece, and that will usually stay regular and predictable throughout. His harmony and counterpoint, however, continually change, and therefore our ears are drawn to this change. Bach's expressive power is built into these changes. It's not built into the rhythm, which underpins the changes. In Mozart, the texture tends to remain very static, always having chords or Alberti bass in the left hand, and melody or figuration in the right. Mozart's decisions in terms of harmonic movement are not particularly complex. It is the gestural and melodic complexity that provide the change that we recognize as interesting to the ear. Each composer makes their own choices regarding what elements they'd like to be complex and which they'd like to be simple. As pianists, we have to recognize which ones are which, and how to know which vector to emphasize to best communicate the intentions behind the music. In our example of Schubert, we have repetitions of gesture and texture. Both are held static, and therefore we're left as pianists to conclude that Schubert wants us to communicate the harmonic changes above all else. So, let's see what Schubert does. The harmonic changes are not particularly complex. We start in A-flat minor. Then we move to C-flat major, the relative major of A-flat minor, which is a rather simple move in itself, but not one that is part of a larger pattern. It's simply a harmonic shift. He holds this key until the end of the first section, and then repeats the whole thing. This is important to note, that once he moves to C-flat major, he holds it, keeping the harmony now static. After the repeat, he goes back into A-flat minor for a while, and then takes a whirlwind tour of a rather odd collection of keys before ending up in A-flat major to end the section. Once in A-flat major, he holds it again, like he did in the C-flat major section in the first half, just repeating and confirming the key. reinforcement of keys is not in itself unusual for any composer, but in Schubert it can be problematic for pianists, particularly when the texture and gestures are also held in stasis. Here's what I mean. If our interpretational ability as pianists is predicated on how we identify change and how this change should be communicated to an audience, then inevitably we find ourselves in trouble when there isn't much change at all to communicate. If Schubert holds in stasis expressive devices like harmonic change, gestural change, and texture, then what are we left to do? We can't just play it as it sits, can we? Let's consider it from a different angle. I'd like to contrast this kind of stasis with another piece of Schubert's, where he hints at the same kind of stasis, but avoids it. The second piece in Schubert's collection of 3 piano pieces, D946, presents 2 separate middle sections, and the second one is longer than the first. This second middle section exemplifies quite well what happens when Schubert holds his gestures and texture in stasis, but keeps his harmonic progressions moving. I'll play this segment here with full repeats. as you can hear, the top melody voice is rather unremarkable rhythmically, especially when Schubert enters the final melodic section, which consists of continuous quarter notes in repeated patterns. The left hand has a rhythmic and textural pattern which is nearly unchanged throughout the entire section. The only element that really seems to change here is the harmony, but there's never a moment in this section where Schubert holds this in stasis. It's constantly moving. In fact, he actually speeds things up a bit as the phrase moves along. The first section holds onto the harmony for a few bars at a time, like this. Then we get into the second part of the phrase, where the harmonic change speeds up, so that there is a change once every bar. What does all this mean for the pianist? Since there are no changes to the texture or gestures, our pianistic goal must be to point out to the audience the beauty or ugliness of the harmonic changes. This is a relatively simple task, given the material. We have the usual boundaries of classical consonance and dissonance, and therefore we know in a general way which chords have more tension and which chords releases tension. The first little section establishes our key, showing the basic boundaries. First, consonants. Then, dissonance, which implies an eventual resolution back to consonance. At this point, Schubert starts a lovely harmonic progression, alternating from consonance to dissonance while cycling through different keys. With this series of progressions, we are given the opportunity to express the changes in a subtle or exaggerated manner, or of course, something in between. If I were to play it in a subtle way, then I'd probably express the changes through the use of dynamics or sound color, so that each key and cadence would be different only through actual sound. If I were to play it in an exaggerated way, then I could use rubato or articulation in addition to the change in sound color to make a larger contrast. There are lots of options, but But the point to note is that because the harmony continually changes, we have the option of being very subtle indeed. In fact, this section works even if we don't do anything at all. Now, how does this compare with the impromptu, where Schubert holds the harmony in stasis? If we perform this section in an exaggerated way, with rubato and articulation being exaggerated in addition to dynamic and sound quality shifts, we get something that seems to work reasonably well. However, we try to perform this in a subtle manner, we tend to run into the Schubert problem of not expressing enough, and in fact, leading to dead zones where it seems like nothing is happening musically. Does this mean that subtle playing here cannot work? In Schubert's music, we find quite often that there are many repetitions of musical material or sections with very few changes made during the repeats. Certainly, his piano trios and a few sonatas have come under heavy criticism for just this concern, that essentially there is too much wasteful material and the music is not efficient enough. But I think this criticism is not precise. In Schubert's music, we have a harmonic density similar to that of Mozart, and although Schubert definitely has a comparable amount of variety in his gestures, he tends to build his piano works differently to Mozart in terms of timescale. When Schubert finds a gesture or a texture that he likes, he will hold this in stasis so that he can explore different keys. Mozart will do this as well, but Schubert simply does it for longer. This is the potential problem. The longer Schubert holds the atmosphere of a section in stasis, the harder it is for us as pianists to communicate any sort of change, because, quite frankly, change will occur at a rate which appears, both to the artist and the listener, slower than necessary. This is the problem if we decide to perform Schubert with a subtle aesthetic, one where we are not making huge, exaggerated moments for every key change. This is the problem we face in the impromptu. All that being said, the hasty conclusion we could make is that there is only one solution to this problem. If Schubert is holding everything in stasis, we have to exaggerate all the changes in order to make it interesting for the listener. Like this. This is the only solution, however. In my view, we have to find the points in the music that are important structurally first. Exaggerate these, and then work backwards. For example, both ends of the sections are very important. These must be exaggerated the most. Then we find the moments that are less important, but still noticeable. For instance, this shift from A flat minor to A minor is huge. also important is the final shift to A flat major. These can be dealt with using dynamic change and also a little ritenuto. The most subtle changes perhaps occur in places like the shift from A flat minor to C flat major near the beginning. This change doesn't have to be done using time or articulation. It can be accomplished solely by changing the sound coloration. The A flat minor section is rather dark and gloomy, with a thick sound. All we have to do is change this to a brighter, happier sound when we move to C flat major. In this way, subtle changes are pointed out to the audience, in addition to the obvious exaggerated changes which occur in the section. Of course, we still have to deal with the sections which are perhaps the most static. The ending sections simply hold a key and repeat this pattern. How do we make this interesting for the audience? Or, as I'd like to think about it, what is Schubert trying to say here? We can do it two basic ways. The first is to follow what's written, hold the key in stasis, and don't do anything with it. It works, especially if everything else prior to this is exaggerated, but I prefer to still add in some subtle changes. The melodic elements here are very simple. In order to make them interesting sonically, we have to treat them as if they're not simple, but outstandingly beautiful. In other words, we have to forget that we've heard anything like this before, and treat these melodic patterns as if it's the first time in history that we've ever played something like this. Each one is beautiful. Each one is well crafted by us. This includes doing subtle things, like taking a little time at the beginning of each melodic segment, and even going so far as to color each chord slightly differently in terms of sound. Once you do this, then you can have a holding pattern that sounds interesting and doesn't merely sound like an unnecessary repetition. The bottom line regarding these sections that are held in stasis is this. We must exaggerate changes, no matter how small they may be, but the methods of how we exaggerate them must be varied and thoughtfully executed depending upon the structure. In addition to all this, we have to reset our listening ears a little when we play, and treat musical gestures and elements that may seem on the surface to be childishly simple as outstandingly and heart-stoppingly beautiful. In other words, readjusting our complexity horizon. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and don't be too quick to see Schubert's potential dead zones as failures of structural control or inspiration. They might simply be opportunities for us to show just how great a pianist we can be. Bye for now.